Hey, it's Alan. I get asked all the time, how exactly does Kadima help people? There are three primary ways. One, we provide one-on-one personalized career coaching with a focus on getting you a great job. Two, we provide an online do-it-yourself course where you can work at your own pace. Three, if you have a job offer, we'll help you negotiate for more. So to find out about these great services and everything else that we offer at Kadima, sign up for our newsletter. Go to SYCKpodcast.com. That's SYCK podcast.com. I promise you, it'll be the best newsletter to accelerate your career. Thanks a lot.
Live from Brooklyn, welcome to the SYCK Podcast, starring Alan Stein, where he steers your career with Kadima. Along with Alan, I'm Russ Reba, and today's episode features another installment of SYCK Tricks. And Alan checks in with an individual who hails from Venezuela, started his first business at 18 years old. But before we get into that, I'm going to pry into the exciting world of what Alan does when he's not working. Not often that you're not working. How has Alan been?
Thanks for asking, Russ. I've been doing well. I've been busy running and growing Kadima, and that has been awesome. Picking up lots of good traction on that. And then also just coincidentally, as we're releasing this episode with Harold, who is now at Amazon happened to reach out to me to interview for a job there as a global business operation lead.
So this is like a job opportunity.
Yes. They apparently have not looked at my LinkedIn profile recently about how I've pivoted out of the corporate world, but I've applied to Amazon 21 times previously. They must have had my resume on file and know that I was eager to work at Amazon, and they reached out to me and said, hey, Alan, are you interested in interviewing for this role?
All right, so can we expect a SYCK shift in Alan's career?
Well, no, to spoil it, no, but I did go through the whole process, as I do advise clients I work with, is like never shut down an offer, never shut down an opportunity, keep those options open. And I went down the whole path, and I didn't think I would get the offer because the odds are usually stacked against you, even if you are a trained professional like myself.
Right.
Went through the first round, went through the second round with the hiring manager, went through the full set of interview loops, which were 5 hours with 5 different people. Had to do a writing sample, which, by the way, was the same exact writing sample that I submitted back in 2019 when I previously applied to Amazon. And surprise, surprise, I actually got the offer.
Wow. Well, see, that's good. There's a whole episode you can create on just that story.
I am thinking about that. I did a lot of good documentation of my thoughts and process throughout the entire thing, and there will be more content about that.
All right, I am looking forward to that one. So let's get into SYCK Tricks, and this is with Harold Pietri.
I am really excited to have Harold Pietri on this episode where we talk with people that have navigated into the tech space, landed at some pretty cool companies, and have just dealt with the ups and downs of recruiting, getting jobs, advancing their career, and so forth. So I'll introduce you quickly, Harold, basically just reading your fairly sparse LinkedIn profile. But it says here, you're a Venezuelan STEM MBA student at University of Rochester, the Simon Business School, specializing in technology consulting. You're passionate about helping customers do more for their customers by leveraging the AWS cloud. I'm guessing that last piece is in there since your recent internship last summer. But I'll hand it off to you now just to introduce yourself and maybe share with people how we got to know each other.
Sure. So basically right now I'm a STEM MBA student at the University of Rochester, second year MBA student. Prior to business school, I worked as chief sales marketing officer for a digital marketing company after undergrad. But before that and during undergrad, about like the age of 18, I actually started my own business. Mostly at first, it was just a regular traditional food distribution business, but eventually I transformed that into an e-commerce business, which was a wild ride. It was pretty interesting, super fun. I guess where we know each other from last year, as I started my MBA journey, I actually thought I wanted to go into investment banking, dove really deep into that. Studied hard for interviews, got some interviews with like JP Morgan and things like that. And as I was going through the process, I realized that it really wasn't for me. I really didn't want to do it. So I decided that what I really wanted to do, what I really felt passionate about was tech, right? And I wanted to break into that industry. And so I had some interviews with Salesforce, I remember, and with AWS at the time. And a friend of the university recommended that I talk to you, Alan. And that was actually a great conversation because I felt like that was the first time that someone actually like listened to my story very well and picked certain things about it that they liked and disliked. And they thought, like you looked at my story and you said, okay, this works for the audience that he's trying to talk to, right? So say this and don't say this. And so that was not only helpful for my Salesforce interview, it was actually helpful for my AWS interview as well. And every other interview that I've done since, and I have gotten other job offers other than just the AWS offer. So that made me just like really see, what to keep in, what to leave out of my story, and how to think about what I'm trying to communicate. Because oftentimes you sort of think about, what is my story or what's motivating me or what have I done, but you're not really thinking about how that's going to be perceived by the other person. And I thought that was great, really helpful. And then, we've been in touch ever since. You really helped me out during some ups and downs in my schoolwork, my internship, and just comparing offers and that sort of stuff. So I'm just really excited to be here.
Yeah, I remember talking to you, and you had an interesting background. You started up a pretty impressive business back in your home country of Venezuela. And something that I often tell people is you have a whole swath of background information, big assets of experience, and you can choose what to pick and leverage as you need, because essentially you're selling yourself to AWS or to Salesforce to have them pay you $150,000, $200,000, whatever the compensation is, and you're selling yourself. So you don't need to tell all the cobwebs, not that you have cobwebs in the closet or anything, but they're irrelevant factors.
Let's get right into it with what to discuss and what to keep to yourself with SYCK trick number 1.
What were some of those things that you thought that you were part of your story? Like after discussing with me and others, you're like, well, you know what? I don't really need to share that. And there's other areas that I should emphasize instead.
Yeah, there's so many. I was watching this video the other day, a TED Talk. I forget who was giving the TED Talk, but basically it was about this type of person called a multipotentialite. And everything that person said about a multipotentialite, I was like, I'm that type of person. I'm realizing it now that there's a name for it. But basically the main idea behind it is that a multipotentialite is a type of person that likes something, right? They'll find something really interesting and they'll dive deep into that, but then they'll get bored of it and they'll want to move on to something else, right? So they'll spend their entire life like trying new things. And the current world isn't really built for people like that, right? Most companies want like hyper specialized people and, that type of person. So for me, fortunately, because I lived in Venezuela, my father was an entrepreneur, and I was able to, basically try out many different things. I've been able to tap into that sort of person that I am, right? And I have done many different things. Fitness Elemental wasn't the only company that I created. I created other companies as well. I've sold like tires. I've sold a bunch of different things. I worked in the finance industry as well. I did an internship in investment banking. Just did an internship in like regular FP&A as well. So I've done like a lot of different things. And so when it comes to just building a story for like a minute and a half, it gets really confusing. So yeah, like you just have to come to the realization, like you taught me that, there are certain things that are more applicable to the job that you're applying to, right? And those are kind of the things that you have to highlight, and then also try to weave a story through them, right? In a sort of chronological way, and leaving out some things, not because they're bad things, but just because they're relevant to the person who's listening, right? I think some of the things that I had told you in my story basically were things about like investment banking and the fact that I didn't want to go into that, right? And to me, that was like a huge thing because that was like a motivating factor. Like, okay, now I know what I don't want to do. I want to do this other thing. But the interviewer is not going to care that I don't want to do IB, right? They just want to know what I've done in the past that makes sense for this type of role. So yeah, I guess for a lot of people, it might be a little confusing to know what to keep in and what to leave out. But yeah, you were really helpful in that. So I'm grateful for it.
Well, thank you. I just invited you on here to pump my ego. So I appreciate
Exactly.
Let's jump right into SYCK trick number 2.
So you mentioned about multi multi-potentialite. I haven't heard that term, but I'm familiar with the work by David Epstein called Range, where, so if you're familiar with that.
I've read his book, yeah. I've read it. Yeah.
So maybe you summarize it, because I've just read the summary and it's on my list, but tell me. Yeah. I think that's probably in the same vein of a multi.
Yeah, it is. No, absolutely. I think the synopsis, if I can, maybe I'll fail here, but I can try to give one. At least it was really interesting to read that as well, because it was really encouraging, right? Because it is a book for people sort of like me, right? The book kind of contradicts the Malcolm Gladwell, I believe, theory of like the 10,000 hours makes you a specialized person, right? And David Epstein, basically what he does is he argues that that is true in kind environments, right? So basically a kind environment would be like golf or chess, where moves are repetitive and situations are really similar across the board, right? But if you think about life isn't kind. It's always really different. Situations are always really different. Like nothing ever happens the same way twice, usually in real life. And so he calls that like wicked environments, right? And so in those environments, it's not really the specialization that allows you to solve the problems that arise. It is the range of domains that you have some sort of like, I guess, like a taste of, or you've been in, right? So like it's the ability to pull insights and experiences from other domains into this particular domain to solve a problem. The theory is like, it's all about creativity, right? Like solving problems is about creativity, and creativity comes from different multiple experiences, right? And so in his book, if I can give you 30 more seconds, he talks about like certain medical discoveries and things like that. Most discoveries in science come from people not who are specialized in the field, but who actually come from like other fields. And then they just happen to stumble across like a medical problem. They're like, I used to like bake or something, and we could probably do some of the techniques that we have there to solve this. And then that's where like the breakthroughs come through. And then the problem is that most universities and most jobs want you to specialize, right? And so what they're actually doing is they're sort of limiting the potential of their talent by doing this, right? So yeah, that's kind of my summary of what it is.
Yeah, and that's spot on for my understanding of it and why it's on my list to read. And it's interesting. A lot of companies talk about diversity. They want diversity, and they're looking just on the surface. You're a Latinx background, Black, women, so on and so forth. But the diversity of experience also is immensely valuable. Mm-hmm. But I tend to find that the hiring manager or the recruiter, even though they say they like diversity, they really want someone that's a specialist in that area. And as you're trying to sell yourself into that company, trying to convince someone to give you $150,000, $200,000, whatever the deal is, you need to advertise to them, market to them that you're specialized in whatever they're hiring you for, even though those other benefits are more interesting to you and actually probably lead to some out-of-the-box thinking.
SYCK trick number 3, how to hyper-specialize your talents.
So how did you try to convey that? And you interviewed with Salesforce, you interviewed with AWS. Are there some other companies that you interviewed with recently?
No, for sure. No, that's a great point. You know, it's funny because things aren't the way that you'd like them to be. Things are the way that they are, right? And so in the current job market, everything that's written range and we're talking about is very beautiful, right? And if you think about it, this is so great. But that's not the reality on the ground. People don't perceive it that way. Well, maybe everyone will eventually read the book and realize, hey, we need people who are experienced in many domains. But like you're saying, that's not the reality today. So you do have to sort of give this perception that you are, in some sense, hyper specialized, right? And you might be, right? Just because you're not super deep into something doesn't mean you don't know a lot about it. But to answer your question about what I did, I just, after my conversation with you, I just think, and I have interviewed for consulting jobs. I have gotten offers for consulting jobs after my AWS offer. So what I like to do is I like to think about, given my experiences, how can I weave a story for this particular interview that has like an aha moment in it, right? So like as I'm walking the interviewer through my story, let's say it's a consulting interview for a pricing and marketing firm. I want to talk about my pricing and marketing background and my sales background. And then at some point in my story, I'm going to say, like, I realized that this was my passion. This is really what I wanted to do, right? And that's sort of like the present in the story. And then I weave it forward and from that point onto, and I realized that not only did I want to do these things, that I felt passionate about these things, but I wanted to do them at your company because of X, 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 right? So it's kind of like weaving a story through the experiences you've had, and then sort of like an aha moment somewhere in there that shows them that you're really passionate about the role that you're interviewing for and their company in particular. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And almost every role you interviewed for, let me guess, you said that you were really excited about that company. You were really excited about that role. And you were interviewing for 10, 12, however many number of roles. But you made them seem like that was your top choice and the top area of focus.
Yeah. And then I was actually talking to a friend of yours the other day about this on the phone. You know, in some situations, it will be 100% true, right? In other situations, it will be, you know, maybe not so true. I guess it depends, right? Like at the end of the day, we want a job and maybe we do feel really passionate about that particular job that we're interviewing for. But maybe there's another one that's like our dream job, right? So every single job that you interview for, you have to sell it if it were your dream job, because then if someone else sells it that way, they'll probably pick that person over you because they want someone who wants to be there. Right. I think where you start to cross the line might be when it's a job that you really despise or hate and don't want to do. And then you sell that as like if you felt passionate about it. I think maybe that would be, you know, crossing the line, and it wouldn't be good for you or the person who's trying to hire you. But yes, I agree.
Heads up for what's coming up with Sick Trick number 4, moving from Venezuela to the States.
Talk about your story about how you moved from Venezuela to the States. And I think the path to that was the Simon School.
Yeah.
But talk to me about your thought process of that and how you decided to do that and why you decided to do that.
Yeah. So, my story is really unconventional. So the interview answer, right? Or like the business school interview answer would be, you know, I wanted to, and this is all true, right? Like I wanted to build on my hard skills and improve my soft skills and blah, blah, blah. This was a school to do it.
And you were interviewing at multiple schools, I'm assuming, like you were interviewing multiple companies. You didn't put all your eggs in the Simon basket.
Exactly. No, that would be the answer, right? But in reality, and I was speaking to a professor the other day at my school, he asked me the same question, like, why did you come here? That I was like, Venezuela is going through a really, really tough financial and socioeconomic situation. Basically, the entire country is in free fall, right? So I had been planning to leave Venezuela for a while, right? I actually went into the corporate world and started working, corporate, right? Worked for a startup. But I decided to do that and stop sort of building my own businesses because I wanted to create this sort of corporate profile because I knew that I was going to have to leave. And so it wasn't much of a choice as to why did I want to leave. It's that I had to, right? And then once I decided that I had to, or I was forced, right? I had to think about what was the best way to do it, right? And so coming here as an international student, you really have to think about at what level do you want to start, right? Because you need to get sponsored. So fortunately, I had an amazing opportunity that's not offered to most Venezuelans, and most Venezuelans don't have access to this. So I'm actually like super, super privileged to be in this position. A personal connection of mine offered me to come to the US as I was still finishing my undergrad, right? And I said, no, not yet, because as an undergrad student, I am not going to be at that level where it's going to be easy for me to get sponsored. Does that make sense?
What do you mean by sponsor here?
So sponsored means like H-1B visa.
Okay.
Right. So like get a visa basically.
Yeah.
Right. So at that level, I knew that it was going to be really, really hard because the competition is really rough. So I knew that I had to come to the US at the master's level. So it was also kind of thinking like, okay, I'm going to have to put up with the situation in Venezuela for like 3 more years so that I can, build that profile and then go and do a master's degree. Now, I didn't know if it was going to be an MBA. I thought it was going to be an MSF first, a master's in finance. But then I ultimately decided on the MBA because of the range of it, right? And the Simon School, they were in contact with me from like the very beginning. I don't know how, but they managed to get like a flyer all the way to my house in Venezuela, which is impossible because there's like no mail system. I was like, okay, I don't know how this thing got here, but they're doing all right. So, and the people there were really nice. The program is fantastic. So that's why I made the decision. But the real reason was I had to leave and I had to think about the best way to do that. I realized I needed to start a new life in the US, and the best way probably for me was going to be an MBA. And I'm glad I made the decision. I think I made the right decision. Yeah.
And many people on this podcast that listen to this podcast may not have heard the Simon School, may not know where Rochester is. It's upstate New York, not too far from Buffalo, I believe. And I've been impressed with Simon School. I went to another MBA program in New York, downstate New York at Columbia, but I've been so impressed with the diversity of talent at Simon School. And they just seem like to have a very scrappy, open and willingness to work with. When I was at Salesforce, when I was even at Facebook, I reached out to some folks at Simon School, and they're very open to dealing with corporations. So they found you. Did you look at other MBA programs as well?
Yeah. So other MBA programs, not so much, right? So I was looking mostly at master's programs at first.
In finance, master's in finance?
Yeah. And I was also looking at some different master's programs at like Duke and other universities like that. But yeah, so to your point, some of the things about Simon, they're number one in diversity according to like US News and World Ranking, something like that. US. And the other thing is like diversity is huge, right? And they have a broad like racial diversity, cultural diversity, but also like international diversity, which I think is really important. And then also, and it's a smaller private school, right? So I guess it's really prestigious among the people who know that it exists, but it is a smaller school. It's like a hidden gem too, right? Just because there's a really strong economics and analytical focus at Simon that I think, well, I've never been to another MBA program, but from what I've heard, right, is not so prevalent at other MBA programs, right? So here you'll be dealing with heavily quantitative issues, right? And you'll be building those really in-demand technical skills that employers are looking for that a lot of MBA students just don't have, because most MBA programs are focused on the soft managerial skills, right? For the most part, right? I think that's changing. I think Simon was the first MBA program to have a STEM designation across the board, right? But then they add a layer on top of that, which is basically the analysis of the quantitative and the data and how to communicate and that sort of thing. So I think that's what makes the program like really, really strong. I don't think I would have chosen another school if I could, put my brain back in like my younger self, knowing what I know. I think I made the right decision because it does prepare you really, really well for the current job market.
Yeah. And I've been impressed, but I was just recommended to it by a friend of mine when I was telling him probably 5 or 6 years ago when I was at Facebook that I was looking to hire diverse talent, and he recommended look at Simon School. I had heard of Rochester. I didn't know the Simon School, but Simon School is not a school that the top tech companies typically think about, although I think Amazon's a pretty big recruiter there. I believe Microsoft's a big recruiter there.
Yeah.
But I don't know if Salesforce particularly recruited there, but how did you take your approach being there? Simon School's a good school. I think it's top 25 in terms of quality MBA, number one in terms of diversity, but it doesn't hit the top of the radar for most of the biggest tech companies in terms of recruiting. So how did you figure out how to stand out and get interviews at Salesforce, AWS? Who else did you interview with?
I interviewed with Microsoft as well.
How did you stand out above the fray, not just within Simon, but within the other 24 schools that are ranked higher than Simon? I think you guys are 25, depending on what rating it's at.
Yes. Yeah, it's 25. I think it's like Bloomberg said it's 25 or something.
Yeah, whatever.
Whatever.
Yeah.
That is true. I don't know. So I think for Amazon and Microsoft, you're right. Simon is getting to be a huge school from where they're recruiting. I know that I think over 10% of my class, or it might be as high as 15 or higher, is actually going to Amazon now. So that is huge. There's a lot of people going to Microsoft as well. So those two, they recruit at Simon. I think because I started recruiting for investment banking initially, and Simon is not a target school, right? You have to be like an Ivy League school or maybe like Columbia or something.
Chicago, Wharton, Columbia, Penn. Yeah. Or like that, Gordon, but yeah.
Usually, right? I knew that for IB, I would have to get scrappy, get in touch with people, that sort of thing. So I came into that mindset with tech as well. However, I do think that tech is different because I feel like sometimes the applications are just like a black hole, right? You throw that thing in there and then something will spit it out, right? If like, I don't know, it's like Harry Potter, the Goblet of Fire or something, like the little ticket comes out or it doesn't, right? With your name on it. So what I did was I applied to a bunch of different roles across a bunch of different tech companies.
For MBA internships?
Yeah, MBA level roles, mostly. And then, some of them hit me back up, right? Like it was, I think I applied to over 200 positions, something like that, probably. So I would spend literally all night after I was done with work on my phone on LinkedIn, just applying to jobs over and over and over again. At some point, I threw out the cover letter. I was just like, I'm not attaching cover letters for each of these things. I'm just going to get volume in there. And then once I heard back from some of them, like Salesforce and AWS, and my role in AWS was in Spain, right? So I even started looking outside the US where I knew that I could potentially get some offers because there was less competition, So yeah, once I heard back from the companies, then I started to think about, okay, contact the school, sort of go on LinkedIn, try to scrape and see who you know or who you might be able to know at these companies to get a word in for you or to, figure out what the process is really like, what the roles are really like. So after the black hole spits the information out, then I started to approach the networking angle. I guess for some smaller startups, you could start the networking process earlier before your application comes in. I know for this consulting role, this consulting offer that I got recently, I contacted some alum, they put in a good word for me, and then they got me the interview, basically. Mm-hmm. So networking does work. I just think the bigger the tech company is, the harder it is to network your way in. It's all about like your resume and how it's polished and that sort of thing. And then once it comes back, then you can contact people, I think.
I would disagree with you. From being at those big tech companies, networking and referrals do help tremendously because they do get so many resumes. And you do need to stand out from those hundreds or thousands of applications. So that's where a recommendation or knowing someone helps even more rather than just spitting it out there, because you're not just competing with other Simon individuals. You're competing with all the other MBA programs that are applying for that as well. So, and also looking at your pre-AWS background, I don't know how many people heard of, I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile, heard of Bank Trust and Company, heard of T4E, heard of co-founder of Fitness Elemental. And they see Simon School, which is a good school, but it's not Harvard, it's not Stanford. Yeah, Penn.
Yeah, you're right. And that is 100% true. That's why when I got responses, I was like, I can't believe I'm getting a response right now. I think it's, as an international student at least, right? A lot of the times you think about, okay, so this is what I imagine like someone who was born here and has worked here all their life sort of thinks about, right? Like I go into an MBA program, I'm going to apply for Salesforce. Who do I know that is working there right now? So for me, that was nobody, right? No one. And no one in the position to be able to, move any chips, right? So maybe someone could give me some information or something like that, but I didn't know like you personally or anything like that you could have moved the needle for me. If you have a network to tap and influential people at the companies that you're applying for, of course, that's 100% going to be to your benefit. Yeah. The position that I was in was sort of, I don't really know anyone here. Yeah. And there's not a lot of alums in these companies, right? That are in like high influential positions. So I just need to apply. I just need volume, basically. Yeah. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. But you were able to be scrappy. You were trying the networking angle also because you spoke to Mark, who knew me. And that, like, he's like, hey, speak to Alan, who's at Salesforce. And I actually happen to know the woman who's leading recruiting at Salesforce. So I think I put in a good word on your behalf there too. You didn't get the role, but I think you got considered for the Salesforce role, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Did you interview?
Yeah, no, I had to cancel the following interviews because I accepted the AWS offer before that loop was over. But yes, of course it works. Of course, like that's kind of, you're right. If someone were able to put in the word for you even before you got the invitation, that would be fantastic, right?
Yes. It's never too late though. But I think what you were doing made sense of like just getting a lot of applications in there, then simultaneously trying to leverage the network, which is harder, but has a higher return on investment.
You're right. Yep.
So how did you get noticed from AWS? Was it because you were applying for this role in Spain?
Probably. I'm not sure 100%, right? It was a sales internship, right? In Spain. I'm trying to think what might have done it. I think when I applied, I started to think strategically, like, the US business schools are probably some of the best business schools in the world. They are, right? So if I'm applying to a job in Spain, I will definitely stand out if I'm doing an MBA in the US. Whereas if I applied to AWS in the US, Simon is a fantastic school, but you're saying, it's not an Ivy League school. So maybe, I'm sort of not at that bar. There's a ton of other people from Harvard applying, for example. So I thought, okay, if I have a US school on my resume and I apply to Europe, that might be seen as really favorable for me. And so I think that might have had some, weight on them giving me an invitation to interview. And then once I was there, sort of about figuring out whether I wanted to stay in Europe. I do have a Spanish passport. Staying in Europe or coming back to the US. And ultimately for me was, I wanted to be back here. This is where I'm doing my MBA. This is where I want to live, basically. So yeah.
Sick trick number 5, how to narrow down the job search that's right for you.
So talk to me a little bit about your thought process. So you mentioned you had the AWS role, so you kind of withdrew from the Salesforce process at the time. Yeah. You also mentioned that you did the AWS internship, and we'll talk about that shortly. And because of your success there, you got invited to return, and you're returning back to the States. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that story, about how you were able to make that occur. But you also mentioned that you recently interviewed for a consulting company. So what's your thought process of continuing to look at what's out there, even though you have this offer at AWS? Like, you're spending some time on that. What's the reason that you're taking those interviews with that company and other companies, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start at the beginning of your question, right? So when I was comparing AWS to Salesforce, I took AWS because AWS gave me a 5-day decision time.
Exploding offer that they call it in the industry.
Yeah, an exploding offer, exactly. At the time, I was still living in Venezuela. I hadn't been able to leave Venezuela. I actually had to leave Venezuela on a humanitarian flight to Spain and then get my visa in Spain and then leave to the US from Spain.
And this was during COVID?
This was during COVID, yeah. So this was like December of 2020. So I didn't know if I was going to be able to get to the US in time to do a Salesforce internship if I had one. And then I also had to compare like brand names and that sort of thing, because it's just an internship, right? It's not the full-time offer. So getting that name on your resume might help you out later on. So that's ultimately why I was like, okay, this is an exploding offer, but I'm going to take it because this is what I have in my hand. What is it? A bird in the hand is in the bush. Yeah. So I took it, right? Then I left to Europe. And then once I was there, I realized at some point, this here in Spain, it's not going to work out. I want to go back to the US. I'm going to have to go back to the US. But, companies are often quite siloed in some sense across geographies, right? So I had to, the way in which I was able to sort of secure an offer, a return offer, it wasn't a return offer. It was just like another position basically within the firm, was by networking all over again, right? And this is where like networking really, really helped me because I had access to internal tools, right? Internal networking tools. So I was able to reach out to some senior people who were just fantastic. They were amazing. And they helped me through the process. And basically they opened up a loop for me for the US, right? So I ended up getting that offer, right?
When you say a loop, like, did you have to go through interview loops or you just said,
I went through full interview loops like an external candidate while I was doing my internship. That was stressful. It was really stressful. It paid off. So I went through the loops. I get the offer, but it's a verbal offer, right? Because it's not an MBA program job. It's a sort of normal rec account executive role, right? And so the recs hadn't opened because it's a role for next year because I'm still doing my MBA, right? So it's a verbal offer. I had the verbal offer in hand, but I realized, this is verbal. This is not written. There's no contract. And even if there's a contract, right, there's some risk to it, but a verbal offer is even more risky. So I believed that they were going to give me the official offer, but I realized that, I need to hedge this somehow. So I started interviewing for other roles while I was waiting for the official offer to come in. And that actually worked out. I actually interviewed for roles that I felt passionate about, things that I really enjoyed and liked. That consulting offer that I got was fantastic. Great company. I really, really loved the company. And it worked out because offers came in almost simultaneously, right? And then that sort of places you in a great bargaining position, right? A position of power rather than position of weakness to negotiate your offers. A lot of thinking. I think I didn't sleep for a week trying to decide where I was going to go, but ultimately I went with the AWS offer. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, if nothing is certain, you got to still keep looking. And I know that you personally, I think you still interview, even though you've been in. You interview, right?
I stopped a couple of months ago, but I was interviewing partially to improve my ability to help people through Kadima, just research. But I also realized that I wasn't learning anything more because interviews are interviews, and I went through 120 of them over the last 6 months. So it's not that different after you go through that.
Yeah, exactly. It is kind of like a game though, right? Like as you play more and more of it, you start to get better at it. So yeah, like something starts to click, you find your rhythm, and then all of a sudden you start getting job offers. It's really weird, right? It's
and you get more practice. And the really challenging thing about the job search is you have so few opportunities to take swings at the plate. Make the analogy of a baseball player. You have to take 100 swings at the plate to like hone your swing. And you also, as a baseball player, you have a coach that's telling you what to do. But there's no one telling you if you fucked up on the interview. And you don't get feedback either. You just get a binary outcome of hit or out, and you don't even know if like you smoked the ball or it was just like a bunt single. So it's really hard for people to improve those skills. That's why I often encourage people to practice, mock interviews. I'm sure Simon School offered that opportunity, but also take interviews with companies, even if you're not super excited about it. Practice those skills. I actually record my interviews and I listen to them after as well to learn on my own. Talk about your decision-making process as you thought about AWS versus this other opportunity. And you said it took you about a week of some sleepless nights to think about the different options afforded you. And yes, you did have leverage at that point. What were the decision variables and perspective that you were making between those two offers?
Right. That's a good question. There were so many. That was the problem. And I was really torn. I think I felt passionate about both roles. Like I really liked the idea of both roles. I liked one more than the other.
What did you like more about one than the other?
Yeah. So honestly, to be very frank, I liked the idea of consulting better. Like I said, it's sort of like the multipotentialite sort of thing where you can do many different things and work across many different companies and solve different problems every single day or every single case that you get or whatever client. You get to learn a ton about many different things, right? And I love the idea. That sounded fantastic. Then there was the work-life balance sort of variable, I guess. I have a wife, starting to get older, not that much older, but I'm starting to consider these things, right?
Families maybe in the future. Yeah.
Family is important. And so that was a big variable as well. And then compensation, as an international student, fortunately, I have been able to get my MBA and I'm like sponsored. So I haven't had to pay for anything for my MBA, but I don't really have any money set aside or anything. Like I came here with basically nothing, with like empty pockets, right? With the hope of getting a job and then being able to like restart my life. The financial component was also like really, really important to me. And also like I have family members that I feel a responsibility towards, if I'm able to build a great financial future for myself, then maybe I can help them out as well. So in the end, I think the financial aspect, and obviously there's the brand name aspect, which you and I talked about, but the financial aspect was the thing that really pushed it over the edge for me. Tech just pays a ton of money, they got deep pockets and they're willing to go even higher than their initial offer. So it's hard to turn down, when there's a huge financial difference. And I'm talking about like consulting versus tech. So like consulting is a big money industry too.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how much more money tech has, that they're able to like basically just convince you with the financial compensation, right? But obviously I wouldn't take a job that is just, great financial compensation, but then just horrible job that I hate with horrible work-life balance. That wasn't the decision. It was still something that I, really liked, really felt passionate about. But yeah, it's very difficult when you're in that position to decide. It's a great position to be in. That's what everyone told me while I was there, but it's definitely stressful.
Yeah. And you talk a little bit about the leverage. So once you have two offers in hand, those are two companies that are fighting over Harold's talent.
Yeah, exactly. No, 100%, right? Like I negotiated with both companies, right? First, I went to the tech company and I told them, hey, like I'm about to receive another offer. I would like XX more because of my explanation, whatever, right? You have to back it up by something. You can't just say, I want more money, right? And they came back with more than I asked, right? And then I thought, okay, this is bad because the other companies is already offering me less money. So how are they even it's going to be even harder for them to match it. So I went back to the consulting firm, basically told them, I have this other competing offer. How can you improve the financial component, which is the one thing that's sort of like pulling me in the other direction. And then they tried, but it's hard. Like I said, tech just has really, really deep pockets. And as an aside, if I may, the reason that I decided to stop IB, investment banking, stop recruiting for it was, I started to think about like the work-life balance, started to think about like the mental toll, the emotional toll of it. And it was really the financial component. Like, make no mistake, most people who go into investment banking, it isn't because they feel passionate about making deals. It's because they want to get a lot of money really quickly, right? But then I had this conversation with an account executive who was at the time working at Microsoft. And she just basically told me, hey, do you want to know what my salary is? And I was like, okay. And when she told me, I was like, that's more than they make in IB. And she was like, yeah. So then I was like, why the heck would I go for this other industry, which is going to work me to the bone, where I can enter this other one where there's a better work-life balance and, I'm going to get paid more money, basically.
Yeah. And the way Amazon pays, and you don't need to go into your specific details, but it's very heavy on the RSUs, the restricted stock units. But that is as good as cash when you work for like established company.
Well, it depends, right? Like, I think that is true, right? But so like Amazon, and I don't have to talk about my personal compensation. This is just general Amazon compensation, right? Like, they'll compensate you in RSUs mostly in years 3 and 4, right? Of whatever you decide. But in the meantime, they'll compensate you in cash, right? In like sign-on bonuses, which are basically, just
it's essentially your salary.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes it even gets paid out like monthly and stuff like that. Yeah. So I don't know that the argument for like, oh, it's RSUs is, valid.
And let me explain my understanding of AWS's comp model, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But they cap everyone's compensation, I think, at around $160,000, $170,000, something like that, depending on the market. And then they give you a big chunk of equity. And equity, let's say it's worth $400,000 for the sake of argument. It vests 5% the first year, 15% the second year, 40% the third year, 40% the final year. But early on, so if that's $400,000, 5% of that is essentially $20,000, but they will give you about $80,000 to get to that $100,000 mark in terms of a sign-on bonus, which will get paid out monthly in your first year. So you get another $80,000 divided by 12 months that comes onto your comp. So that's comp. And then the RSUs will continue to increase, assuming that Amazon's business goes up like it is. So that's essentially what they're doing, right?
Yeah. Yep. That sounds very accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's complicated for people to understand. And I truly believe a lot of these, it actually makes a lot of sense because they're trying to incentivize long-term potential. And something that they also do there, which I've heard, is between year 2 and year 3, when you go from it's 5%, 15%, then you go 40% of your chunk, they will send out a note to managers and say, hey, do we really want to keep Harold here between year 2 and year 3? Because all of a sudden he has a lot of equity coming here. And you as a manager should think consciously of if Harold is worth that big 40% of that $400,000, which is now worth maybe $600,000. Like, it actually makes a lot of sense from an incentive structure. But I don't think many employees really understand the dynamics of that.
No, you're 100% correct, right? The equity is gaining value, right, over time. So when you get to year 3,
the 400,000 could be like 800,000.
And you better be pulling your weight, right? Because if not, then it doesn't really make sense to keep you around, especially because the RSUs aren't guaranteed. But yeah, I think the prettier version is that, you'll be an owner in the company and that, you want the stock to rise, right? And hopefully if you're doing your job well, you'll sort of tip it a little bit, maybe a cent.
Yeah, you're one of the million employees at Amazon that are helping raise its stock price.
Exactly, right? And so you'll be doing a great job. And so then when you get to year 3, your manager doesn't even have to think about it, And
they keep layering on more equity as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that every year you're investing something.
Be proactive and take charge of your career is SYCK trick number 6.
So you mentioned something else earlier, that you initially had the MBA opportunity in Spain. It wasn't necessarily your top choice of an MBA role at AWS, but you saw that as your competitive advantage to get your foot in the door. And I highly advise that. Get your foot in the door and then figure shit out once you get there.
Yeah.
And you were effective at figuring your shit out, of getting a role back in the States. So talk to me about, you were an intern, you were there for like 10 to 12 weeks over the summer last year in Spain. How did you navigate the opportunity for yourself to be able to move over? Because it's unusual. Most people come back with their MBA internships in the same role. And I think that's what they initially offered you of, we're going to convert you, but you got to come to Spain. And so talk to me about how you were able to take proactive charge of your career and make that happen.
Yeah. So I was proactive, right? But I think I stumbled many times in the process, right? I think I made choices that I probably wouldn't have made now, right? So basically, when you find yourself in an internship with sort of a return offer that you know is not right for you, you realize that you have to move quickly because you have a short amount of time. Like you said, I only had 11 weeks actually. And so basically what I started to do first was I started applying to multiple roles within the company in the US, right?
While you were at your internship.
Yeah.
Was that encouraged? Like, how did you even know to do that?
It wasn't encouraged, right? And I think
it was or was not?
It was not. It was not. And then I think also it might have been the wrong decision to make because it just looks weird.
Yeah, I would think you might have got your wrist slapped there.
Yeah, exactly. And then also I would contact the people who were opening those recs, right? So that didn't work.
And those roles were like looking for instantaneous hires, and you still have
exactly. That was the other blunder and stupid thing on my part that I realized, like, hey, I'm trying to convince these people who have these recs open to like sort of hire me for next year and like hold this position off. Right? Yeah. Like after 3 or 4 weeks, I was like, okay, I'm approaching this the wrong way. This is off, right? But the good thing that came from that really was the fact that I just talked to so many people because I could see in the roles that were open, I could see who was hiring for them, right? And so I contacted those people over the internal communication channels and stuff until finally, some pieces started moving and there were several opportunities there. And then one of those opportunities actually paid off. I got in touch basically with the right person who saw my profile, realized like, hey, okay, like, yes, let's put you through a loop. And if you pass, we'll bring you in on the team, which was fantastic. But then you realize, you have to interview again. And then the stress of interviewing. But I passed that. And thankfully, I got my offer basically. But it was not easy. If I could go back, I would do so many things differently. I have had my own businesses. I have been in like managerial positions and stuff, but at smaller firms and working at these larger firms, you really do have to learn how to navigate them, learn how to think about how people are perceiving your actions as well. Maybe you're not doing anything with bad intent, but it might be perceived that way if you don't communicate it correctly. So there's that whole thing. And then also you always still have to remember that, you're in charge of your own destiny. So some people might say like, there's no way to do something and you just have to figure out the way to do it. Right. Maybe without their help, it's just because maybe they can't see it because they're not you and they don't have the same motivation that you do. But just try to do it in a way. This is me talking to my old self, by the way. Just try to do it in a way that doesn't, anger anyone or step on any toes, basically, if you can.
SYCK trick number 7. You're going to want to write this down if you're a first-year MBA wanting to land an internship.
I'll finish this up with 2 questions for you. One, and you're talking about giving yourself some advice. So I'd love your advice that you would give for first-year MBA students that are trying to land an internship. So I think you talked a little bit about it, your method, but there's lots of MBA students that are in their first year. We're recording this in December. So the internship recruiting season is probably starting in full in a month or 2. But how do you get someone to stand out? Like, what advice do you offer to people, like maybe some first years at Simon that are reaching out to you about how the hell do you get into AWS? What advice do you have for first years of how to get a great internship?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I think something that I've seen and something that I've seen among like international students as well, which is concerning to me sometimes, is the fact that people are very relaxed about it. I'm not saying stress yourself out, but you have to be very determined in your job search. You have to be very scrappy. You have to prepare. You have to send out applications every single day, numerous times a day, like numerous applications, basically. You have to spread your net as wide as you can. You have to basically go for it. You have to really put in the time, put in the effort, or else you're not going to get it. And there's a lot of competition out there. There's a lot of people that want it probably more than you and are putting more work into it than you are. So you got to make sure that, you're putting in as much time and as much effort as possible into your job search. I think it's the most important thing, at least, and I'm speaking now from like an international student perspective, if you want to stay in the US, of course, and not go back home. What you really came here to do to get your MBA is to get a job, a good job, right? Of course, you came here to learn, right? That's all great. But if you learn some stuff and then you have nothing once you leave, no job offer, then kind of mission failed, right? So you got to put in the work. You got to put in the hours. You got to flip that switch and not wait and just go for it 100%. I guess polish your resume, the usual stuff that you always talk about. Polish your resume, leverage your network, apply to multiple positions, really work on your star stories, work on your pitch, work on all that sort of stuff. If you need to do cases like I did in consulting, I cased a bunch of times with a bunch of people and mock cases, right? Get better at that. Put in the time, basically. But my general advice is just take it seriously. Nobody's going to come. Maybe if you're like, and I don't even know if this is true, but maybe if you're like the number one student at Harvard, someone's going to come and like, hey, I want you to come work for me at my company. That's not true for most people. Most MBA students applied to their position and there were 10,000 other people applying there, right? So nobody's going to come and just pick you out of wherever you are. You got to go looking. So that's my biggest advice.
Sounds like hustle, be proactive.
Yeah.
And then the last question I have, someone that is in an MBA internship. So this will be someone for next summer. And you were trying not just to get a role, but a role in a different country. But most people are just trying to get a role and get invited back. So the MBA internship is 10 to 12 weeks. You mentioned yours was 11 weeks. What's the best advice that you have for people once they're in that internship to get the offer to come back?
Okay. Yeah. So first, don't do what I did. Okay. So don't try and get an offer somewhere else, right? So like if you decide that that's the role for you, if that's where you want to go back, which is fantastic, that's a lot easier, I think. There's a great book by Jody Glickman, which is called Great on the Job. And basically, she talks about what you should and shouldn't do on the job and how you should behave and how proactive you should be. But the general advice kind of is basically try to make your manager's life as easy as possible. Try to anticipate their needs. Try to be proactive in what you do. Throw yourself at projects you know that you will be successful in. When someone says, who wants this project, and you know you're going to be good at that particular project, put your hand up because the next project might not be the right one for you. And so basically try to steer your time there as best as you can, and also be proactive about, making sure that you're an excellent person to have working for you, basically, which is not ideally what I did, right? But that would be the ideal at a position, an internship where you want to return.
But you didn't piss people off too much because you still did get the offer to return to Spain, and they did consider you for these
and I did a good job in terms of, I did a really good job in terms of my actual like project and, the deliverables and making sure that was like top notch, right? You want to make sure that you cross all the T's and dot all the I's, right? You want to make sure that your work is impeccable, right? Is as good as possible, right? And it's a push, right? It's 12 weeks. You're probably not going to be that intense in your real full-time job, because if you were that intense, you'd probably burn out really quickly. But in your internship, you probably do want to be intense and make sure you make a good impression in terms of your work quality and what you bring to the table, I think.
Awesome, Harold. Well, we're at time, and I don't want to keep you too much from your studies or your weekend or whatever you have going on, celebrating your offer from AWS, hanging out with your wife, whatever you're going to do this weekend. Wear a warm parka up in Rochester. But thank you so much. I'm so glad that our paths crossed. So happy that Mark put us in touch. He's going to be a future podcast guest himself.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. And it's been amazing to hear your story and your growth. And you have a great career ahead. And I'm sure we will be in constant contact.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. It was great. It was really fun doing this with you.
Quite an inspiring story from Harold. Thank you for being on the show with Alan today. We appreciate everyone listening to the SYCK podcast. If you have not had a visit to the website lately, syckpodcast.com. That's SYCK. So, Alan, what's fresh on the website?
Hey, Russ, we have launched our blog and are actively putting content there on a weekly basis. So check out the blog. I reveal lots of my background, lots of tips about how to get a great job, lots of good content there in the blog. So check them out.
All right. Well, speaking of tips, we hope you enjoyed today's SYCK Tricks. For Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba, and you are going to love the next episode of the SYCK podcast.